Welcome to the SkillTorch Disrupt Podcast, where we dive into the world of innovation and technology. My name is Malika, and I'm also the founder of SkillTorch, which is a recruitment company specializing in the digital and tech space. So I believe we're all now like 10th or 11th episode now. Today I have with me Kevin Mullen, who is the Chief Strategy and Product Officer at Roq.ad. He's joining us to really talk about a bit more about, data marketplaces, a bit more about integrity and transparency in that world. So, Kevin, over to you. It'd be great if you can kind of tell us and our audience a bit more about yourself and what you're going to talk about with us today.
Yeah, good day, Malika, and thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. This is a subject that's a bit near and dear to my heart, so I'm glad to spend some time with you on it. Again, my name's Kevin Mullen. I'm the Chief Product and Strategy Officer for Roq.ad. Roq.ad's a cross-device identity company based out of Berlin, Germany. Our business is understanding that the identifiers that represent people online are in fact the same person. So your phone, your tablet, and your PC are all the same man or woman. We don't care who you are. We don't need to know much more about you than that. But we do want to sell you that next flight or widget. So we can try to stitch together who those people are with using machine learning. Mm-hmm. With that in mind, spent the last north of 10 years, I think, in advertising technology here at Roq.ad most recently. Prior to Roq.ad, I spent some time organizing the identity business as a consultant for the team at Rakuten in the Americas. I also spent prior to that 3.5 years, almost 4 years, running the advertising tech or the international business at Drawbridge, which is sort of the 1.0 of what we're doing here at Roq.ad. And before that, spent about 4 years running the ads and mobile business for a company called Trustee, which did internet consulting and privacy, consulting for internet and mobile companies about how to maintain their privacy stance. So it's always a sort of a fun balance between making sure we're honoring people's privacy and making sure we're meeting all of our legal obligations and at the same time being able to know a little bit more about people so we can give them something that's more targeted and compelling.
Okay, right. Yeah, I mean, I've been working in recruiting in the ad tech space for several years now, and I know there's continuously talks around transparency and making sure that every flow of the campaign, there's sort of like transparency about how much is being spent. But now, especially recently, with the GDPR regulations, there's a lot of talk around data privacy. And I know that there are companies that are trying to do what they can to mitigate around that. But I still, as we talked about last week, I think there's still a gap and there is still a lot to be done around this. And we talked a lot about data marketplaces around that as well, didn't we?
Yeah, there's plenty of work still to be done. The good news is we've got a great industry partner in the IAB, the Internet Advertising Bureau, who manages something called the Transparency and Consent Framework in Europe. They've actually expanded that Transparency and Consent Framework to a global privacy platform, which I'm personally very excited about because it means that I can track explicit consent much more easily. Mm-hmm. Which, if you don't know anything about internet privacy law, there's two things to remember. It's transparency and consent, right? The idea is you got to tell people what you're doing with data about them, and in an open, honest, and fair way.
Exactly.
And then you have to make sure that they say yes to that. Now, these are simple, reasonable concepts, but as always, the devil is in the details, right?
Yeah, I remember I did a podcast episode with Keith as well. This was about like accepting cookies and rejecting it. I mean, even now when I go on websites to this day, it's actually easier for me to click accept, and it's actually very difficult for me to click reject. But again, those that click reject, how are we covering that data?
Well, Functionally, you don't, and that's okay, right? It is a completely acceptable position to be the person who says, I don't want anything tracked about me online, and I want to say no to any third-party cookies. I want to say no to any location tracking. All of those things are totally reasonable for consumers to decide. The irony, though, is that most of them actually, if they really got down to the details of what that decision meant, most of them would say yes. And in fact, that's really what actually happens. You may say yes just based on sort of immediate convenience, and I want to get into the website that I want to read right now. You also may do so with a more drawn out thought process, but the underlying information is that when you spend time online, you are functionally the product, right? You are being marketed to, and that is what is paying the bills for the publisher. The thing is, if I'm the product, if reaching me is the goal, I'd like to be reached with something that I might actually have some interest in. So I use this example often in my discussions with customers. One of the things that we get that I get on a regular basis, and it's from the same publisher every time, is ads for egg freezing. Now,
I like that analogy.
I'm a 40-some-odd-year-old man with 2 children. I don't think that that's quite a fit for me. But I get them almost daily. And I get them because, God love them, the people at Pandora haven't figured out that I'm a different person than my wife, and that my wife is now married and has 2 children and has moved from San Jose to nearer to San Francisco. But because they don't have all of that data stitched together, they haven't figured all of that out. They're operating on the profile she created at 20-something when she was single, which is still her active Pandora profile. Now, you can read into that in fact I use her Pandora profile. That's because she curated way better channels than I ever did. I was too lazy to do it, so I give her complete credit for having better taste in music than I. That said, I'm still getting ads about egg freezing because somebody doesn't really have either the willingness to spend the effort or the capacity within their team to understand me better as a person. If they did go, say, buy an identity graph so that they could split the difference between my use cases and my wife's use cases, and if they did something like buying some basic demographic information about the people that aren't my wife, they would know that probably they should be marketing, electric vehicles and not, which I might vaguely have an interest in, versus egg freezing. But alas, they do not. And here I am talking to you about egg freezing on a lovely Monday morning.
I mean, that's that again, there's obviously a lot of work to be done because again, they're being targeted based on data that's, not current, not new, and very likely probably still getting charged on that original data, right?
Very likely. So they're probably paying for that continuously. There's a lot, as you say, there's a lot to be done. The charging portion is interesting in and of itself. Most, as you well know, most data in ad targeting is generated on a CPM basis, cost per 1,000 impressions hit. If they're paying for me to be at some level, some advertiser is saying, I want to reach women over 30 in the San Jose area. They're being charged for that on a CPM basis, and they're getting me. Well, it's not a great fit, but okay. That is what it is. To an extent, there's always misses in internet data. We obviously try to make it better, but the dirty little secret in gender is that it's just better than a coin flip.
Yeah.
Most gender databases are derived from things where you have accounts of multiple people. There are some places where it's actually pretty good. So if you buy gender data from Tinder, for example, it's probably going to be better than buying it from Verizon or British Telecom, right?
Right.
Whatever that might be. There are always going to be better and worse data sources for different specific things. But again, they're all charged on this notion of a cost per thousand impressions, or at least for the most part they are. That creates some sort of strange incentives inside of the ad tech world. And that's a lot of where we were talking last week, and I think is a sort of an interesting thing to delve into. These incentives aren't necessarily bad or wrong, but they are notable, and they're very rarely talked about. And I think that it's worthwhile to sort of shed some light on the topic. When you deal with owning a data asset or having a data asset that you want to license in the ad tech world, essentially what you do is you package it up into a segment, a list of IDs that can be reached on the internet, and you price that segment, say men. And men is a category, men in the UK is a category of, in theory, 30 some odd million people. In practice, you're going to have a list of 6 million IDs that represent men, people that you know or you believe to be men in the UK.
Right.
That 6 million IDs, then if you reach them in practice in your ad targeting, then you pay a cost per 1,000 impressions. Let's say you reach 1,000 of them, that's 50 cents, 50p. Usually ads are, even in the UK and Europe, most ads are traded in USD. So you're probably talking about 50 cents US rather than 50p. But that's the baseline idea, right? There are some strange incentives, though, because you may want to use a targeting segment not in a positive direction, but in a negative direction. So, for example, I might say, instead of I want to reach women, I want to reach people who are not men. And in that case, you can run that same list of 6 million men in the UK as a negative targeting element, right? If you think about the way that this sort of works in a functional standpoint, you just created a blacklist. Things I don't want to target. So if I see ID ABC or ID DEF, those are men, and I don't want to target them, and therefore they're on a blacklist. Well, of course, if you're paying out the data provider, the owner of that data to license, based on hitting people in their target segment, but you're actively saying, I don't want to hit those people, then necessarily you're not going to hit anybody in their segment. So if your payment schema is, I'm going to pay you for reaching person X, Y, or Z, and your goal is to not reach person X, Y, or Z, then you're not going to pay them anything. But you are, in fact, using their data, right? You're using that tool. Now, that's actually okay.
Yeah.
It's not the worst thing in the world. If there is some level of unpaid usage that happens throughout a platform, that's something that most data owners can accept, so long as they are making enough money overall from the people who are using it to target in a positive direction that they're happy with the deal as it stands, right? I give data to people who don't pay for every type of usage quite regularly. But if they're paying enough for usage A and usage B they get for free, fine. I'm willing to just make the contract about usage type A because it's easier and it's most of what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I tried to make the deal about a price for each type of ownership of usage, it would be too complex. It would be too hard to deal with. And I probably wouldn't get anything done because I'd be fighting for, small slivers of cash when it probably isn't justifiable. I should just call that a loss and move on. And again, all of that is okay so long as we understand what's happening. What sort of blows my mind in the world of data within the internet is that many of the people who are doing data deals don't really think about these outcomes.
They don't think about what they're actually purchasing, really. You mentioned something about
right, or what they're or even what they're selling. So and for what uses. So the one that I talked to, I talk to my customers a lot about this notion of using location data. And location data is fantastic for a great many things, right? For it's great for generating useful points of interest or personality traits, concert goers, for example. Location data is a great way to develop a list of concert goers. You just have to know when the concerts are, and you look at their phones, and they're going to be on their phones at the concert. Little rough mid-pandemic, but most of that data has come back in recent months.
That's good.
People who have cars. That one you wouldn't think about that often, but if you go to petrol stations regularly, location data is a great way to figure out that somebody's regularly going to the petrol station.
Yeah, that's true.
Because they're monkeying on their phone for a few minutes while they're filling up their car. And those people necessarily own cars with internal combustion engines. Or at least ones that are going very regularly, right? And they drive a lot. And you can tell how much they drive by how often they fill up their car with petrol. All of which are super interesting sort of use cases. But if you're targeting accessories for electric vehicles, then you want that list of internal combustion car owners, but you desperately want to use it negatively, right? You don't want to reach those people. You want to reach people without cars or people with EVs. And so you put those guys all on a blacklist and you never pay for that. Now, the platforms are somewhat complicit. They allow for this to happen in a somewhat opaque manner. But if you're the location player who's deriving that, you're not getting any payment for that segment of internal combustion car owners. And the question that I have for them is that okay? There's a similar sort of grouping there. Now I'm saying, okay, I want to use that internal combustion car list, but actually I want to target it positively. Here's the rub. I don't want to reach those people on their phone. Their phone is where they gave that location info that turned them into a list. But I don't want to target them there. I want to target them in connected television, or I want to target them on their PC, because what I want to give them is a big shiny new car ad. Maybe I want to now convert them to an EV user, and I'm Tesla. Well, in order to convert them, I've got to give them something Elon Musk knows quite a bit about. I've got to make it sexy,
Right.
right? Laugh as you might, he named his cars sexy for a reason. Um, if you look at that strategy, the way to get a sexy car ad is not to put it on a phone. So now, even though I'm positively targeting that list of internal combustion car owners, I'm doing so in such a way that I don't reach them on the tool that developed that information about them.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, what I would do is I would put in that platform, okay, here's the list that I want. It's a list of a bunch of phone IDs, IDFAs and Android IDs. Then I'm going to expand that audience using an identity graph. Probably the platform has the capacity to do that internally on their own. Most of them have identity graphs. A lot of them are powered by Roq.ad, but that's not what this session is about.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And what do you mean by the graph as well? Sorry, what do you mean by the graph in that context?
So remember earlier, I talked about knowing that a phone, a tablet, and a PC are all the same person.
Yeah.
Well, if I generate a list of IC car owners based on their phone, but what I really want to do is reach them on their CTV or on their computer, then the way that I would do that is I would take that list of phones and I would bounce it against what you describe as an identity graph, which says that phone equals this other ID, which is a computer, and this third ID, which is a CTV. And then after I do that, then I've got a list of phones and CTV IDs and computer IDs, right? Then I would remove all of the phone IDs because I don't really want to reach those people there. And then I would put that campaign out in the market, and it would reach as many of those phone and CTV users as I could reach, as is possible at that time, over the course of the next, say, 30 days. And probably they're going to reach me, right? If everything works out, if Tesla spends more money than United on that ad space at that time, I use United as the example because I'm from San Francisco, and San Francisco is pretty well owned by United Airlines. And so I fly United. And they're always looking to market me because I'm coming to Europe all the time for work. So they're always trying to get me to buy the next flight to Berlin. Baseline idea is if Tesla is willing to spend more on that ad space for that CTV ad than United is, then Tesla's going to get that CTV ad.
Right.
Now, again, there was a price point identified for the ad space. Let's call it $1 per 1,000 impressions. And then there was a price point for the data used to derive that that I wanted to target that person, and that was 50 cents. Well, and there was a price point for the use of the graph. Again, let's call that another 50 cents. Well, what does Tesla pay? They actually pay not $2, not $1 plus 50 cents plus 50 cents, but because the phone was not ever targeted, it was never reached, they pay $1 for the ad space and 50 cents for the use of the graph, but zero for the original use of the data. So the outcome is Tesla pays $1.50 instead of what you could rightfully argue is the $2 that they owe.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, this has been happening for years, and it's not really a surprise to most industry insiders. It's a question of whether you're willing to sort of change the game for that 50 cents. I don't think you should have to. I don't think it's worthwhile. Most data companies would tell you the amount that happens is not enough for me to justify trying to break up a deal with a major ad targeting platform, right? If you're dealing with a major DSP, they're generating so much income for you that trying to break up that deal for that small amount of leakage is probably not worth it. What sort of gets to me is I'm fine with that, but I want us to understand that the leakage is happening. And it's the transparency, and arguably it's my history in privacy and privacy law and privacy consulting that gets me to this. It's the lack of transparency that drives me nuts.
Yeah, it's so crucial in the industry.
So, whether it's a B2B or direct to the consumer, I think there's like a need for transparency.
Yeah.
And this is just one of the many ways where I think transparency could be pretty advantageous to our broader industry. I'd love to see, I'd love to see some more openness from the platforms on this. Again, I don't think anybody's doing anything wrong. I think they're trying to make a deal that's easy, and those are justifiable. But I'd like them to open up a little bit about how that chargeback happens and recognize that it's not ideal for the data company, and that it's a reasonable thing to be concerned about as a data company.
Right.
Now, the irony for me is, of course, I'm telling you this right now, but I actually have some level of interest in maintaining the status quo. Because remember, I, as a graph provider, am going to be in that middle bucket that gets used and gets paid, even though the data provider does not. Again, that's also okay as long as we're open and honest about it. If that's what's happening, okay. If not, what I actually encourage our data provider customers to do is just ask. Just be upfront about, if this happens, how will you pay us? And the answer is probably going to be, we won't. And then you have to make the right decision for you, right? Like, as a data provider, if your data is used quite regularly in negative targeting, then it can become a problem. But that presupposes that you've got a broader data set that is used for negative targeting, and negative targeting primarily, and that's somewhat unlikely.
Right.
Because you really you want to develop a data set that people want to reach rather than the other way around. Just in general, I don't want to develop a list of vegans so that Hormel chili can use it for negative targeting. I'd rather develop that list of vegans so that Beyond Meat has somebody to reach. I mean, the examples are silly, but they're actually not far from the truth.
No, it's not far from the truth. Talking just quick one, so just shifting the focus to the advertisers themselves. So, does the practice of actually charging for the graph instead of the original data sort of influence the overall expenses for the advertisers? I know it sounds a really basic question, but...
Yes. Well, it can, but it doesn't necessarily. What do I mean by that? Well, if you were really trying to maximize your value, you could use graph pricing to your advantage and do really creative, strategic negative targeting and graphing, and have the negative target segments be more expensive than the graph, and influence your buying on a in a positive way for the advertiser. That is to say, they would pay less money per impression.
Right.
In practice, though, it almost never happens. And partly that's a structural thing. So the way that agencies generate value is through their knowledge and capacity to do positive targeting. So it's rare for an agency to say we're going to negatively target X, Y, and Z, and have that make it into a media plan. And so when you're going to buy that impression volume at scale,
Mm-hmm.
you're not targeting negatively, you're targeting positively. Every once in a while, you'll get somebody at a platform or somebody at an agency who thinks about the inverse and targets in the inverse manner, but it's somewhat of a rarity.
Right.
Which is why most data providers aren't super worried about this level of leakage. It just doesn't happen as often as you might think. Honestly, if I were at the agency level, I'd probably do this all the time, and try to make slightly higher margins. But I'm not, thankfully. But again, we're just trying to make sure that people understand what the economics are, right?
Right.
My goal isn't to object to something that the industry has decided upon. My goal is to say, hey, that's fine. Let's make sure we understand what we decided.
Right. So, I mean, in light of these sort of practices, so what sort of a further advice would you give to advertisers who want to sort of make the most out of, data marketplaces while actually ensuring transparency and cost effectiveness? So if you can just go to like further advice around that, what if it was you and you were able to influence?
What I would say is broader advice than just the digging deep on the pricing. First and foremost, don't be afraid to spend more for better data. You'll get what you pay for there. But also think long and hard about the data set that the type of person you want to reach and how you generate information about them.
Right.
So how does one get to car buyers? Well, that might be a list of cookies from AutoScout, and it might be people who have been to a car dealership over the last 90 days. Those are derived very, very differently, right? The AutoScout data is coming from the fact that I went and looked at a car on AutoScout. Maybe it's my car, I don't know. And it's got its pluses and minuses. And then the location data into an auto dealership that was derived from a phone, it's got its pluses and minuses too. And you have to ask yourself one sort of overarching question is, does the data that I want to use here make sense given who I want to reach and how I want to reach them? So from, if what I really want is, heavy browser takeover ads, probably I want the AutoScout data.
Right.
If I'm doing footfall attribution to the Honda dealership instead of the Ford dealership, I probably want the location data. But it depends on how you want it. And that's, look, if you are cognizant of who you want to reach, that's step one. And how you want to reach them is step two. And then you want to take the data set and match that so that you've got as much direct linkage as possible. Why is that advantageous to you? Well, it may cost you a little more money, to be honest with you, as an advertiser, but it will be more likely to be accurate, right? You will have a higher likelihood, or maybe I should say this in a different way. You'll be less inclined to be selling me egg freezing services if you've got direct matches.
Oh, that's so funny.
Don't get me wrong. Obviously, I'm in this business, but identity graphs do a fantastic job of stitching together identifiers. They're not perfect. They never will be. But the more direct linkage you have to behavior and intent, the better you're going to do from a performance perspective. So people talk about ad spend a lot.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the core metric anybody should be thinking about. I think they should be thinking about return on ad spend. Because if I reach the exact right 10 people and I pay $1,000 a piece for each of them, and they all buy a $100,000 car, then I've done my job, 10 times over, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's the way I think about it. I try to be, I'm a very results oriented guy as it relates to this stuff. We try to talk about, in our business, we don't talk about volumes. We talk about success rates. Our customers ask us about what our volumes are, and we say, here's what they are, but it doesn't matter unless you can reach them. Go try our data.
Right.
The other thing that I would, and this is again beyond sort of this this push and pull between data providers and platforms, I would say to advertisers is look at the look back windows. Recency matters a huge amount in data sets, and very few people think about that.
Yeah, that's true.
So from our perspective, we refresh our full data on whatever it is, something like 58 million UK consumers every week, and push that to all of our customer platforms. And we don't use any data more than 30 days old to build our matches. The reason that we make that commitment is that we recognize that it doesn't matter if I know about your old phone. It doesn't matter if I know about your old computer.
Yeah.
It only matters if I know about the ID that you're going to be reached on tomorrow. So from our perspective, recency is a hugely critical thing. The good news is if you don't have recent data, you're probably not going to pay as much. The bad news is you're probably not going to reach as many people.
And target as many people relevantly, exactly.
That's it. So you have to be relevant and you have to be immediate. Otherwise, my old phone that sits in my drawer doesn't get used to go surf the internet very often. So it's going to be tough to reach me on that. And I think about that quite regularly. Like I'm not, I've got an old computer that my son uses to go on Zoom for school, and it's only used for that, right? The browser is never open. The question is like, the fact that you know that as me, does that help? The answer is no, because you could never reach me there.
Exactly.
So from our perspective, it's make sure you're recent, make sure the data that you have aligns with what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And then just know what you're buying, right? Like very few people, like oftentimes you talk to people and they're like, well, I bought these age and gender segments. Okay, well, where'd they come? I don't know. I bought age and gender segments. Well, as we said earlier, Tinder's going to do a lot better on gender than AT&T or British Telecom.
Right.
Who's going to do better on age? Probably not Tinder, because people are lying.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
for better or for worse, from what I gather, I thankfully got married right before online dating became like a very common occurrence. So I didn't have to do it. But from what I gather, pretty much vast majority of men on Tinder are lying about their age.
Yeah, there's a lot of integrity work that needs to be done on that app.
Look, I'm very lucky to not have been a part of that bubble. I don't envy anyone who is. It seems like an absolute nightmare cesspool, but I'm sure there's some nice people out there too.
No, I've heard loads of success stories on there as well. So, I mean, again, it's just the new norm. It's the new reality. So,
like a great many things, change has occurred, and I'm a supporter of change and new technology. I just don't want to have to implement it myself. Is much the same way I feel about Slack. It's a great tool. I know that people use it and love it, and they can email me and tell me what happened on it.
Yeah, very true.
I know I sound like a dinosaur, but
no, but you know what? Do you know what? I used to love the 90s. Like, I wish we can go back to the 90s, honestly, like when I was born. They were the great years.
I will say this, though. I saw somebody sent me some internet list of stuff, like crazy stuff that happened in the 90s. And in retrospect, some of the things that happened on Jerry Springer and who was that lady, Jenny Jones, those like probably wouldn't hold up in today's terms. Right?
No.
I digress. Some of that stuff was like, I looked at some of these things. I was like, wow, that's shaming 16-year-olds for their dress choices. Like, that's probably not going to hold up.
Anyway, Kevin, I'd love to talk to you all day long, but I'm going to stop it right here. Thank you so much for jumping on this podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on. You've given some really interesting insight about the ad tech landscape, and also just really reminding all of us about where finding out, asking questions around where your data is coming from, and just really emphasizing how important transparency is around it.
Absolutely. There's some great work being done across the board, whether it's certifying data or using third-party tools like TCF to verify consent for it. Work for all of them. So please look out there and make sure you know what you're buying and from where it came.
Wise words from Kevin. Thank you again.
All right. Thank you, Malika. Have a fantastic day and talk soon.